The night the hitman breached the walls of the government house, Yu Park realized that his brother's badges were a shield against the world, but a target for the family. For years, he believed that blood was a fortress and silence was his duty. He worked the night shifts, obeyed every whim, and carried the weight of the household on his back without a word of complaint. But in a home shared by a police officer, a mafia-linked brother, and two wives hungry for status, a lethal jealousy had been brewing like a slow-acting venom. By the time Park saw the cold steel of the barrel, the price of his life had already been paid by someone sharing his dinner table. Hui Wu and his younger brother Min Jae were men of immense, yet conflicting power. While Min Jae climbed the ranks of the Japanese police force, Hui Wu maintained the family's iron grip on the shadow world. Their success reached a peak when Min Jae married Naomi, bringing her into the fold of the prestigious government house provided by the department. When the youngest brother, Yu Park, joined them in Japan, the house seemed to offer the promise of a united future. Life was rhythmic and, at first, harmonious. Park found a grueling part-time job at a distribution center, working 3 graveyard shifts a week that left him hollowed by exhaustion. Despite the physical toll, he never hesitated to assist Naomi with the household chores, scrubbing floors, fetching heavy crates of water, and running errands through the cold city streets whenever she asked. To Park, this labor wasn't servitude. It was his way of honoring the tripod of their brotherhood. But one gray morning, the harmony shattered. The bonds between the Yu brothers were forged in the cold, narrow alleys of their youth, long before the badges and the shadow of the Mafia defined them. Hui Wu, the eldest, had always been the mountain, a silent, immovable force who carried the weight of the family's survival on his shoulders. Even as he dipped his hands into the dark waters of the Korean underworld, his primary directive remained the protection of his kin. Min Jae, the middle brother, was his direct contrast. Sharp, disciplined, and driven by a burning desire to legitimize the family name through the rigid structure of the law. Then there was Park, the youngest, the heart of the trio, who looked at his older brothers with a reverence that bordered on worship. When Min Jae secured a prestigious transfer to the police department in Japan, it wasn't just a career move. It was a chance for a new beginning. Hui Wu, utilizing his connections and his own rank within the force, facilitated the transition, ensuring the brothers remained a single, unbreakable unit. They moved into a sprawling government-provided house, a structure of white walls and polished floors that felt like a sanctuary. To them, the house was a fortress, a symbol of how far the sons of a broken lineage had climbed. The early days in Japan were defined by a shared sense of triumph. The brothers lived with a rhythmic harmony that felt permanent. In the evenings, they would sit together in the living room, the air thick with the scent of roasted meat and the easy laughter of men who had finally outrun their past. Hui Wu and Min Jae would discuss the intricacies of their work, the hunt for criminals, the politics of the precinct, while Park listened in silence, content to be the one who kept the engine running. He was the one who ensured the tea was hot, the floors were spotless, and the laundry was folded. He didn't see it as a burden. He saw it as his contribution to the fortress. "We are a tripod," Hui Wu would often say, his voice deep and gravelly. "If one leg fails, the whole thing collapses. But as long as we stand together, nothing can touch us." The bond felt ironclad. When Min Jae announced his marriage to Naomi, the celebration was a family affair, a joyful expansion of their circle. The brothers welcomed her not just as a wife, but as a sister, a new guardian of the peace they had fought so hard to build. Park, in particular, was eager to help, stepping up his efforts to ensure the house remained a paradise for the newlyweds. He worked his part-time night shifts and spent his days in service to the household, believing that every gallon of water he carried and every room he cleaned was an investment in their collective future. They were 3 brothers in a foreign land, shielded by power, law, and blood. They walked the streets of Japan with the confidence of men who knew they had a safe harbor to return to. But as they settled into the quiet luxury of the government house, they failed to notice the subtle shift in the air. They were so focused on the enemies they might face in the streets that they never thought to check the locks on the doors leading into their own hearts. They believed the fortress was impenetrable, never realizing that the strongest walls are the easiest to rot from the inside. The transition from the warmth of the family hearth to the biting chill of the Japanese night became the new rhythm of Yu Park's life. To support his place in the household and contribute to the brothers' rising status, Park took a grueling job at a local distribution center, working the graveyard shift from midnight until the gray fingers of dawn brushed the city skyline. It was a world of heavy lifting, industrial humming, and the isolating silence of a foreigner in a strange land. Yet, as he hauled crates and tallied shipments, he kept the image of the white government house in his mind like a talisman. He wasn't just working for a wage, he was working for the tripod. Returning home at 7 in the morning, Park's body usually hummed with a deep, vibrating ache. His eyes would be bloodshot, his joints stiff from the damp Japanese cold. Any other man would have collapsed into bed, but for Park, the end of the shift was merely the beginning of his domestic duty. He would quietly slip through the back door, trying not to wake Huiwu or Minjae, only to find Naomi already waiting in the kitchen. At first, the requests were small, phrased with a delicate smile that Park mistook for sisterly affection. "Park, since you're already up, would you mind fetching the fresh water from the outdoor tap? The pipes in the kitchen have such a metallic taste this morning." Park would bow his head, mask his exhaustion, and head back out into the cold. Then came the errands, trips to the market for specific spices she needed for Minjae's breakfast, the heavy scrubbing of the entryway floors, and the constant movement of furniture to satisfy her changing whims. Naomi's presence in the house had brought a new level of cleanliness and order, but it came at the cost of Park's rest. He became a ghost in the daylight hours, moving through the halls with a rag or a bucket, his devotion to his brother's wife becoming a silent obsession. He wanted so desperately for Minjae to be proud of the home. He returned to that. He ignored the way his own hands began to tremble from lack of sleep. He saw these tasks as an extension of his love for his brothers. If Naomi was happy, the house was peaceful, and if the house was peaceful, the Yu name would flourish. However, the nature of the chores began to shift. The "since you're already up" turned into "before you sleep." Naomi would watch him from the kitchen table, sipping tea while he polished the dark wood of the banisters. She began to test the limits of his endurance, asking him to run to the far side of the district for a specific brand of tea just as his eyes were beginning to heavy with the weight of 20 hours of wakefulness. Park never complained. He took pride in his resilience, believing that his silent labor was the glue holding the family's new life together. He didn't see the way Naomi's eyes followed him, not with gratitude, but with a calculating coldness, as if she were measuring exactly how much weight a beam could take before it finally snapped. To Park, the exhaustion was a badge of honor. To Naomi, it was an opportunity to see just how much of the youngest brother she truly owned. The morning of the incident arrived with a heavy, gray fog that seemed to seep through the very floorboards of the house. Yu Park returned from a double shift at the warehouse, his muscles screaming and his mind clouded by a thick, suffocating veil of sleep deprivation. Every step toward the stairs felt like wading through deep water. He reached the room he shared with the absence of his brothers, his only goal to collapse onto the thin mattress and vanish into the darkness of sleep for a few precious hours. He had barely closed his eyes, the edges of consciousness fraying, when the door was thrown open with a sharp, violent bang. The sound sliced through his exhaustion like a blade. Naomi stood in the frame, her face set in a mask of rigid expectation. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of the sweat still drying on his brow. She simply pointed toward the door and demanded he go to the outdoor tap to fetch water for the morning tea. For the first time in years, the machinery of Park's obedience stalled. He didn't move. He stayed sprawled on the bed, his voice coming out as a dry, pained rasp. "I'm sorry, Naomi," he whispered, his eyes still closed. "I am too tired. My legs, they won't carry me back down those stairs. Please, let me sleep. Just this once." The silence that followed was more chilling than the winter air outside. Naomi didn't argue. She didn't shout. She simply turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing with a finality that Park was too delirious to interpret. He fell into a fitful sleep, unaware that the peace of the house had just been permanently severed. When evening fell and the heavy boots of the elder brothers signaled their return, the atmosphere in the kitchen had been carefully prepared. Naomi did not greet Min-jae with the usual warmth. Instead, she sat in the shadows of the dining nook, her eyes downcast, a picture of wounded dignity. When Min-jae asked what was wrong, she let out a long, tremulous sigh. "It's Park," she said, her voice a fragile thread of practiced sorrow. "I asked him for a simple hand today, just a little help while my hands were full. And he was so cruel, Min-jae. He looked at me with such contempt. He told me that since he is a man of this house, he doesn't have to take orders from a woman like me. He said I was nothing more than a guest who overstayed her welcome." Min-jae's face darkened, the pride he felt for his younger brother clashing with the protective instinct he felt for his wife. He looked toward the hallway where Park was still sleeping, his jaw tightening. He didn't see the way Naomi watched him from behind her hand, checking for the exact moment the seed of doubt took root. Min-jae tried to settle the matter peacefully that night, speaking in low tones about respect and the harmony of the home, but the damage was invisible and absolute. Park apologized, confused by the weight of the tension he couldn't explain, but Naomi never looked him in the eye again. The cup of water had remained empty, but the well of their relationship had been poisoned with a lie so potent that no amount of truth could ever wash it clean. A year drifted by, marked by a strained, icy politeness that made the sprawling government house feel smaller with every passing day. The brothers remained successful in their duties, but the domestic air was stale, thick with the residue of Naomi's lingering resentment. It was into this simmering quiet that Zola arrived, a radiant presence who seemed to carry the warmth of 1,000 suns in her smile. As the new wife of the eldest brother, Hui-woo, she was the final piece of the household puzzle. A beautiful black woman with a gentle heart and an observant eye, Zola did not enter the house with the cold calculations of hierarchy. She entered it with a genuine desire to love the family she had joined. For Yu Park, Zola was nothing short of a miracle. In the year following the water incident, he had become a ghost in his own home, retreating into the shadows to avoid Naomi's sharp, judging gaze. But Zola refused to let him fade away. From her first week in the house, she sought him out. When he returned from his grueling graveyard shifts, he no longer found a closed door or a list of demands. Instead, he often found Zola in the kitchen, brewing a pot of tea or preparing a light meal. "You work too hard, little brother," she would say, her voice a melodic contrast to the harsh silence he had grown used to. She didn't call him a servant or a subordinate. She called him family. They began to share long conversations in the quiet hours of the morning. While the rest of the house slept, Park found himself opening up to her in ways he never could with his brothers. He told her about his dreams for the future, the weariness of the warehouse, and the simple joys he missed from their hometown. Zola, in turn, shared stories of her own life, her laughter ringing through the hallways like a bell that drove away the shadows. She treated him with a dignity that Naomi had systematically tried to strip away, and for the first time in years, Park felt the heavy weight of isolation begin to lift. He found himself eager to help her, not out of a sense of fear or obligation, but out of a sincere desire to see her smile. If she needed help with a heavy crate or a repair in her room, Park was there before she could even ask. They became a team, navigating the complexities of the large house together. Zola's presence acted as a buffer, a breath of fresh air that seemed to neutralize Naomi's toxicity. In those early months, Park allowed himself to believe that the tripod was finally stable, reinforced by a woman who saw him for who he truly was. But as Park and Zola laughed in the kitchen, they were rarely alone. From the corner of the hallway, or the shadow of the stairs, Naomi was always watching. She saw the way Zola leaned in to listen to Park's stories. She saw the way Park's eyes brightened whenever Zola entered the room. To Naomi, this wasn't a beautiful friendship. It was a threat. Every smile they shared was a brick in a wall that Naomi had not built, and she could not allow it to stand. As she watched them, the jealousy that had been a flickering ember for a year began to catch fire, fueled by the sight of a bond she could not control. The transition from friendship to suspicion did not happen with a scream, but with a series of soft, jagged whispers. Naomi was a master of the slow erosion, knowing exactly where the cracks in a person's confidence lay. She began to shadow Zola's daily routines, slipping into the kitchen or the laundry room just as Park exited. She would wear a look of profound, manufactured pity, sighing heavily whenever Park's name was mentioned. At first, Zola ignored the theatrics, but Naomi was patient, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "It's a shame, isn't it?" Naomi remarked one afternoon, her voice as thin as a razor's edge. She was watching Zola prepare a plate of snacks for Park. "He's so good at making people feel sorry for him. I used to be just like you, Zola. I thought he was the sweet, misunderstood younger brother. I did everything for him." Zola paused, the knife hovering over a piece of fruit. "Park is kind, Naomi. He's never been anything but respectful to me." Naomi stepped closer, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial hum. "That's his gift. He picks the person with the softest heart and clings to them until he can start making demands. He did it to me for a year. He'd act exhausted just to watch me scrub the floors he should have cleaned. And when I finally asked him to help, just a cup of water, Zola, he told my husband I was a useless outsider who didn't understand the U bloodline. He's using you to get close to Hui Wu. He wants the eldest brother's favor so he can stop working those night shifts and live off our husband's hard work." The lie was wrapped in enough half-truth to feel heavy. Zola knew Park was tired. She knew he valued his brother's opinions above all else. Naomi saw the flicker of doubt and pressed harder. Over the next few weeks, every gesture of Park's was reinterpreted through Naomi's toxic lens. If Park offered to help Zola with a heavy bag, Naomi would whisper later that he was only doing it to make her look weak. If Park stayed late in the kitchen to talk, Naomi warned that he was gathering intelligence to report back to Min-jae. "He talks about your background, you know." Naomi lied, leaning against the doorframe one evening. "He told Min-jae that you don't fit the family image. He's trying to drive a wedge between you and Hui Wu so he can remain the primary influence in this house. He's jealous of you, Zola. You're the wife of the eldest. You have the power he wants." Slowly, the poison began to take hold. Zola started to watch Park not with warmth, but with a defensive scrutiny. She noticed his exhaustion and, instead of seeing a hard-working man, she saw a manipulator playing a part. The long conversations in the morning grew shorter, then ceased altogether. The laughter that had once brightened the hallways was replaced by a suffocating, watchful silence. Park, sensing the change but unable to name its source, tried harder to please her, but his every effort only confirmed the manipulative behavior Naomi had described. The wall was built, the friendship was dead, and the youngest brother found himself once again standing alone in a house full of family. The seasons in Japan bled into one another, marked not by the changing colors of the maple trees, but by the deepening frost within the walls of the government house. 5 years passed in a slow, agonizing crawl, a long montage of shared meals eaten in absolute silence and glances that carried the weight of unstated accusations. The house, once a sanctuary of fraternal ambition, had transformed into a labyrinth of invisible borders. Yu Park became a master of the periphery, learning to move through the rooms like a shadow that left no trace. Yet the more he tried to shrink, the more his presence seemed to offend the women who shared his roof. In those 5 years, the rot reached the very center of the family. Min-jae and Hui Wu, once the proud guardians of their younger brother, grew distant, their perceptions warped by the constant, nightly dripping of venom from their wives. When they looked at Park, they no longer saw the hard-working boy who had followed them across the sea. They saw the problem their wives described, the ungrateful, manipulative squatter who sowed discord simply by existing. The brothers retreated into their careers, the police precinct and the shipyard becoming their true homes, while the domestic sphere was left to the slow, methodical cruelty of Naomi and Zola. The coldness manifested in 1,000 small, jagged ways. Zola, once Park's greatest ally, had become his most vigilant warden. She no longer set a place for him at the table, leaving him to find whatever scraps remained after the others had finished. The laundry he used to help her with was now hidden away, his own clothes left to sit in the damp of the basement until they smelled of mildew. When he returned from the warehouse, bone-tired and hollow-eyed, he would find the heaters turned off in his corner of the house, the warmth reserved only for the true members of the family. Naomi's victory was complete, but her appetite for destruction had only grown. She and Zola formed a dark, unbreakable pact of shared grievance. They spent their afternoons whispering in the kitchen, their eyes darting to the door whenever Park's footstep was heard. Every success the brothers achieved, every promotion and every expansion of Hui Wu's shadow influence, was used as a justification for Park's exclusion. To the wives, Park was a relic of a past they wanted to bury, a reminder of a hierarchy they intended to dismantle. The emotional arc of the house had flatlined into a permanent state of dread. Park continued his night shifts, his body aging prematurely under the dual strain of physical labor and psychological isolation. He stopped trying to explain himself, stopped trying to reclaim the love he had lost. He lived in a state of silent martyrdom, believing that as long as he endured the cold, the family might still survive. He did not realize that the rot had already hollowed out the foundations. The brothers were strangers, the wives were conspirators, and the house was no longer a fortress. It was a pressure cooker, waiting for a single spark to turn the 5 years of silence into a scream that would tear everything apart. The inevitable fracture finally arrived when Min-jae received his official transfer orders to the Fox Head Police Headquarters. The departure was swift, a flurry of packed crates and official documents that signaled the end of the three-brother era in the government house. As the middle brother stood by the door, his gaze lingered on Yu Park, who looked more like a skeletal remains of a man than the vibrant youth who had arrived in Japan 5 years prior. In a rare moment of clarity, cutting through the years of Naomi's lies, Min-jae made a final executive decision. His spacious room, the largest and most ventilated in the house, would be given to Park. It was a gesture of silent apology, an acknowledgement of the graveyard shifts and the unheated corners Park had endured. The moment the door latched behind Min-jae and Naomi, the air in the house turned radioactive. Zola stood in the center of the hallway, her face a mask of incredulous fury. For her, the master room was not just a collection of square footage. It was the ultimate symbol of status. As the wife of the eldest remaining brother, she viewed the room as her divine right, the throne from which she would finally rule the household without the shadow of the youngest brother looming over her. She confronted Hui Wu that evening, her voice a serrated edge that cut through the silence of the dinner table. She demanded that they seize the room and relegate Park back to the small, windowless box he had occupied for years. But Hui Wu, perhaps gripped by a final, flickering spark of fraternal loyalty, refused. He cited Min-jae's explicit wish and the traditional respect for a brother's parting gift. It was the first time in 5 years he had openly sided with Park, and for Zola, it was an unforgivable betrayal. The argument that followed was the Room of War, a verbal siege that lasted deep into the night. Zola's resentment, cultivated for half a decade under Naomi's tutelage, finally boiled over. She accused Park of being a parasite, a manipulator who had bewitched both brothers to keep his unearned comforts. She paced the hallway, her footsteps thundering above Park's head as he sat in his new room, staring at the walls in a state of catatonic dread. He didn't want the room. He wanted the peace that had died years ago, but he was too exhausted to even offer to move. By morning, the Cold War had turned into an active insurgency. Zola stopped speaking entirely. The kitchen, once a place of shared tea and friendship, became a forbidden zone for Park. She would lock the cabinets when she heard him approaching and empty the rice cooker into the trash rather than let him take a single grain. She treated his presence in the larger room as an act of physical violence against her dignity. Every time Park crossed the threshold of that room, he felt the weight of her stare, a gaze so filled with concentrated loathing that it felt like a physical pressure against his spine. The room was no longer a place of rest. It was a battlefield, and Zola had decided that if she could not have the space, she would ensure that the person who occupied it would never leave it alive. The silence that followed the fight for the room was not the empty quiet of peace. but the heavy, pressurized stillness of a storm about to break. Zola moved through the house with a terrifying, rhythmic precision. Her warmth had long since been extinguished, replaced by a cold, crystalline focus. To her, Yu Park was no longer a person or even a nuisance. He was a stain on the floor of her life that refused to be scrubbed away. Every time she passed the door to the master room, she felt the phantom weight of a crown she had been denied, and the bitterness finally curdled into something dark and decisive. Her transition from domestic cruelty to cold criminality happened in the space of a single moonless night. While Hui Wu was away on a night patrol, Zola reached into the back of her closet and pulled out the velvet box containing her wedding jewelry, the heavy gold and precious stones that symbolized her entry into the Yu family. She viewed them now as payment for her exit from this misery. She did not go to the police, and she did not go to her husband's associates. Instead, she used the whispers she had overheard during 5 years of living with a man who walked the line between law and underworld. She sought out a contact in the city's industrial fringe, a man who dealt in permanent solutions. The meeting took place in a cramped, neon-blurred alleyway behind a silent warehouse, miles away from the respectable white walls of the government house. The air smelled of salt and diesel. Across from her stood a man whose face was a map of scars and indifference, a professional who didn't care about family loyalty or the tripod of the Yu brothers. He only cared about the weight of the gold Zola placed in his palm. "I want the house cleaned," she whispered, her voice devoid of its former melody. There was no hesitation in her eyes, no flicker of the woman who had once laughed with Park in the kitchen. The youngest. It must look like a botched robbery. Something sudden. Something that leaves the room empty. The contract was sealed with a nod. Zola returned home and walked through the hallways with a ghostly calm. She watched Park from the kitchen as he prepared for his graveyard shift, noticing the way his shoulders slumped and how he meticulously avoided her gaze. He looked so small, so fragile, yet in her mind he was a giant blocking her path to the sun. She felt no guilt as she watched him drink a glass of water, the very thing that had started this war years ago. To her, the gold she had traded was a small price to pay for the silence she craved. That night, as the clock ticked toward the early hours of the morning, Zola sat by the window, staring into the darkness. She had crossed a line that Naomi had only danced around. She had invited the wolf into the fortress, believing she could control the kill. She didn't realize that when you bring an assassin into a house shared by 2 police officers and a man with Mafia ties, the shadows you unleash don't always strike the target you intended. She waited for the sound of a breaking lock, her heart beating with the steady, cold rhythm of a woman who had finally decided that blood was not a bond, but a currency. The 3 a.m. silence of the government house was absolute, a heavy shroud that usually signaled the only peace Yu Park would ever know. He lay in the master room, the vastness of the space feeling more like a cavern than a sanctuary, his body finally surrendering to a dreamless sleep. He did not hear the side gate groan, nor did he see the shadows detaching themselves from the fence. But the Yu house was never truly unguarded. While Hui Wu walked his beat, the shadow half of his life, the security agents tied to his Mafia interests, remained stationed in the unmarked sedan across the street, their eyes trained on the threshold of the tripod's fortress. When the back door was breached, it wasn't the sound of a lock breaking that woke the house, but the sudden, violent roar of a flashbang in the hallway. The assassin, a man of cold efficiency, moved toward the master room with his suppressed pistol raised, but he was a fraction of a second too late. The security agents had already vaulted the perimeter, their own weapons drawn. The hallway became a kill zone of strobing light and muffled thuds. Zola, gripped by a sudden, frantic terror that her plan was dissolving into chaos, threw open her bedroom door just as the gunman pivoted. In the flickering darkness, confused by the intervention of the third party, the assassin fired wildly. A single round caught Zola in the shoulder, spinning her back into the doorframe with a choked scream. The struggle was brief and brutal. The agents tackled the intruder, pinning him to the floor just as Hui Wu and a backup unit of police arrived, alerted by the silent alarm. The lights of the house were thrown on, blinding and unforgiving. Yu Park stumbled from his room, his hands shaking, his face pale as he looked at the carnage. He saw his brother, Hui Wu, standing over the bleeding assassin, and he saw Zola slumped against the wall, her white nightgown blooming with a crimson stain. "Who sent you?" Hui Wu's voice was a low, terrifying rumble, the sound of a man who had finally realized his house was on fire. The assassin, his face pressed into the carpet, said nothing, but his eyes darted toward the velvet box sitting open on the hallway table, the box that had held Zola's wedding gold. Hui Wu's gaze followed the look. He walked to the table, his fingers tracing the empty indentations where the jewels had once rested. He looked at the contract tucked beneath the box, scrawled in a hand he recognized all too well. The silence that followed was more destructive than the gunfire. Hui Wu turned to look at Zola, his eyes filled with a hollow, crystalline grief. He didn't look at her as a husband looks at a wife, but as a judge looks at the condemned. He then looked at Park, who was weeping silently, not for his life, but for the realization that the poison Naomi had planted years ago had finally claimed the heart of their home. The truth was unveiled in the harsh glow of the hallway lights. The greatest danger had never been the criminals they hunted or the rivals in the underworld. It had been the quiet resentment of the women they loved, festering in the dark until it became lethal. As the sirens wailed in the distance, the Yu brothers stood in the wreckage of their brotherhood, realizing that while they had won the war for the house, they had lost the family that made it a home.